Hey gangsters, what's happening? It's Monday, August the 10th, and it's a video making kind of day. It's been a few weeks since I did an update on the Accurate Miniatures 1/48 scale b-25b, and it's time to get caught up on that. I actually have quite a bit to talk about there, and it's going to be pretty detailed because I've been wrapping up the preparation for getting the fuselage closed up. And that's definitely been an adventure. And so what I'm going to do is I actually have a clip that I recorded several weeks ago while I was in the middle of that process, and then so I'll show you that first, and then I've got another clip that I'll show you as it is right now. So let's get to it. Okay, so as you can see, this entire subassembly that comprises the fore and aft bulkheads of the bomb bay and the auxiliary or the add-on fuel tank and the roof, and then the navigator's compartment is supposed to fit into the fuselage like so. Now this presented several situations. One is that, as you can see, it's got to fit flush down against that lower portion of the fuselage, both front and back. The problem is that this bomb bay rack, or the bomb rack here, was preventing it from moving all the way down to where it was low enough to actually be pseudo flush there at the back. You can see it's not going to ever be perfectly flush because the profiles just don't match. But at any rate, the bomb rack was a major problem, and you can imagine that in the instructions they're telling you to put this bomb rack piece in after all of this subassembly has been glued in place, which I think is, again, as I said before, just crazy. So what I ended up having to do, because again, I'm 100% committed to not having the bomb bay doors open. I was 95% committed. There was a slight chance that I was going to leave those doors open, but that slight chance got thoroughly shouted down when I started really getting into this. Because what I ended up having to do was clip off the entire... Boy, I'm just dropping stuff all over the place here. Watching me do anything live on camera is always a comedy of errors. Anyway, I ended up having to clip off the entire top section of this bomb rack. There was a spar that ran all the way along there. Had to clip that off so that the bomb bay assembly could move far enough that direction to sit where it was supposed to. Also, had to clip off the top of this beautiful little hydraulic valve here. And again, none of that really matters because it's all going to be, closed off. I could have just removed the entire bomb rack, but at this point I had it so thoroughly glued down just from trying to get it to conform to the sides of the fuselage that I decided that was actually more trouble than the other option. If you were going to leave the bomb bay doors open and you wanted to be able to see all this, you'd want these ribs to fit flush up against the sides of the fuselage. And that would require taking material off the back of each one of them. Because you can see, when you look right in here, the profile just doesn't match. So you'd have to take material off the back of each one in order to be able to do that. And now you can also see what I was talking about in my last video, where this hydraulic line does not have the gaps in it that allow those ribs to clear like it does on the opposite side of the fuselage, where apparently they remembered to include that, and you can see it. You can see those gaps right here. because I've clipped away that portion of the bomb rack on that side as well. Now on this side I had another problem. This radio section, remember I told you that it did not have good locating pins or tabs? Well, this chunk of the radio right here totally interfered with the bulkhead of the bomb bay right here. You can see where I've basically just chopped that out. It did look like the other side, more or less, but I just chopped that away. And let me tell you how I do that. I could go for my Proxxon rotary tool and my burr, and I did do that a little bit, but these things right here, my Xuron sprue cutters, this is like having two hobby knives with you know, the leverage of a pair of pliers, and it works great for just quickly snipping away material. So, you know, sometimes you got to go outside the box for a different sort of solution if you don't want to spend a whole bunch of time grinding and whittling. And that came into play on the front portion of this subassembly. Now, I don't know if you remember, I told you that this section was a bunch of different pieces, that this piece right here was glued to the front of this piece right here. Now, that had an alignment feature on the bottom of it right here, and when I glued it in using the alignment feature, it was flush right across the top here, as it should be. But when you turned and looked at it from this direction, this piece here was angled about 20 degrees clockwise, and these two sections were supposed to be coplanar. So basically twisted around clockwise. So how did I undo that? Well, I got the aforementioned sprue clippers, and I just completely, let's see if we can get this thing to focus here. You can see where I just completely removed the alignment feature from the back there. And in that process, this entire piece here came off, which was fine. Basically then I had a very little material left to reposition it. So what I did is I put a tiny bit of super glue on the stub here. Then I took this piece and I dipped it in some accelerator and very carefully lined it up and then just boop, stuck it right on there. So at that point I had taken care of the twist in this direction, and so I went ahead and on the back side here you can see I piled on a bunch of super glue and immediately hit it with some accelerator so that that would be solid. Okay. Then the problem that I had was that if you look at it from this direction, this edge was no longer parallel with this edge. It was actually angled about 15 degrees again to the clockwise. And that's going to show right behind the bulkhead that's behind the pilot's seat. So what I did is I took my clippers, and I just used some old brute force ironworking technique, and I took a clip here and then I angled about 15 degrees and another clip so that I just had a very slender triangular wedge removed from that allowed me to basically hinge this front section back over on itself and push this to where the two edges were parallel. Now I didn't want to stay that way, obviously, so again what I did is a tiny drop of super glue, pinched it shut, and then touched it with a wire that had been dipped in accelerator and immediately got that locked in place. And then again, put some super glue on the back of it to reinforce it, hit it with some accelerator, and everything is lined up. Now, you will see, if you look at this, that the two edges are not collinear like they need to be, and there's a bulkhead that runs across there. So if that's a problem, I'll just add a little bit of sheet styrene to the front of that and bring it out enough to where it touches the way that it's supposed to. But the point being that, you know, sometimes violence is the answer. And you may have to sort of take a way of thinking and skills from something outside the workbench and apply those to solve a problem at the workbench at a much smaller scale. Because this is obviously pretty ugly back here on the back, but who cares? Because once I smooth down that little bit of filler that I put there and shoot some paint on it, and it's all hidden inside the cockpit, or inside the fuselage. Okay, you can see, now that I've wrestled that sort of into place, you can see what's going on there, and nobody will be any the wiser, you know, because of the limited visibility into that section of the aircraft. Okay, so that's where things stood several weeks ago. And now to where I'm at currently. As you can see, I've continued working on the joint around the engine nacelles. I've just been continuing to sort of tinker away at that using various filling methods. And you can see that here on top that I've had to go to the nuclear option on this joint around this piece right here that is the back end of the supercharger inlet. That's something that I really was hoping to avoid doing, because it's going to be a real pain in the ass to rescribe and re-rivet that. But I just couldn't get happy with the way that that joint looked. And the real problem was that it wasn't consistent on both sides. So as you can see, I felt like I had to just go ahead and shovel in some squadron green putty, and haven't quite got around to sanding that yet. It's going to be a super pain in the ass, and I am in absolutely no hurry to get busy with that. Something else that is going to be no fun is this joint right here. When you put the cow flap section on, you can see that not only is there going to be a joint right here on top that has to be filled, because that's all one continuous piece of aluminum, but when you rotate around to the side, you can see that this edge is not consistent at all, and that keeps that whole piece from going on the way that it's supposed to. So that's going to be some work, and that's not going to be any fun, but hey, you know what? That's kind of what I signed up for with this kit. One thing that I want to talk about, though, for a second is a couple of the filling methods that I've used. At this point, I have worked my way around this entire joint with 4 or 5 different methods. Right here, I've filled in with some sheet styrene. Obviously, I've got the squadron green putty. I have used copious amounts of Mr. Surfacer 1000 along this joint. I've done a lot of scraping, and basically my goal with all my filling work is to do 0 sanding. Now obviously that's impossible, but it's a worthy goal, and for me, working towards that helps me preserve important detail like rivets and panel lines that I don't want to have to redo, because the bottom line is I can't redo them as good as they were done originally. So I don't mind sanding, it's just that I don't want to undo the good work that the tooling guys already did for me when they made the molds. Now, one thing that I want to say about using Mr. Surfacer 1000 or 500 or 1200 or whatever you use, it's kind of frustrating for me that often when people talk about it, in fact, almost always when people talk about it, they don't mention that there's 2 different ways of using this stuff. And it's what I call the wet or the dry method. The dry method is pretty obvious. You put it on, you let it sit for a few hours, and then you sand it down, which is what I've done in this area right here. Now, something that frustrates people a lot with Mr. Surfacer is that as it dries, it sort of tends to shrink into or sink into the gap that you've put it over. And if you just put on one layer and then try to sand it down, you often find yourself having to do it again and again. So what I do is I put it on there, I give it 5 or 10 minutes to sink in, then I put on another layer. And then I repeat that until I've got 3 or 4 layers, and then I allow that to cure and sand it down later. And I find that that usually works pretty well. And even though it may appear that there's still a line, that by the time you sand down that thickness of Mr. Surfacer, that it all comes out flush. Now, the other way of using Mr. Surfacer is the wet approach. And that's where you put it on a seam and then come back either immediately or even after it's dry with a solvent like IPA or lacquer thinner or acetone and a Q-tip, and basically wipe off everything that you don't want. Now, where that's different is that it's going to still leave evidence of the seam. There's just basically no way that you can wipe that off where it's absolutely flush and leaves no evidence of a joint. And so I use that method when I want to minimize a joint, but I still want evidence of, say, a panel line being there. And some people get a little freaked out about using lacquer thinner because obviously it melts plastic in a hurry. But what I do is I get the Q-tip fairly wet so that it removes the Mr. Surfacer quickly, and I make a couple of quick passes, and then I back off and go to a different area, and I let that lacquer thinner clear off from where I was working. And I just keep doing that until it's gone and I'm left with nothing but Mr. Surfacer inside the joint. And that pretty well minimizes any nasty effects that it may have on the plastic. If it does craze it a little bit, I just come back with some 4/0 steel wool and buff it down. Now, my other method of filling that I've been using on this project is this stuff right here. This is epoxy sculpt, and it's a 2-part epoxy putty mixture that gives you 2 to 3 hours of working time and has the benefit of being water soluble during that time, but it cures rock hard. So what that enables you to do is roll it into little tiny sausages and cram it into places like this right here. You can just, I'll get a pointer here so that you can see exactly where I'm talking about. Right here at the back of the nacelle, there was a joint about 1/4 inch long that was probably 50 thousandths wide. Obviously difficult to do any sanding on that once it's filled. So I made a little sausage out of this epoxy sculpt, stuffed it in there, and then used a wet Q-tip immediately to rub it down flush. And at that point, basically, I've got that joint filled, and I've done 0 sanding at this point, which, as I said, I love. I've also used it over here. You can just barely see it. It's in this joint right here and a little bit right here on the leading edge of this wing. I love this stuff. I read about it in Diego Quijano's Volume 1 of the Aircraft Modeling Technique Encyclopedia, and I had never even considered using it before as a way to do body work. I knew that people used it for, sculpting, making figures and things like that, but it never occurred to me to use it as a joint filler, and I gotta say, I think it's a brilliant technique, so I will definitely be adding that to my repertoire. Okay, as far as the fuselage goes, lots of progress there. As you can see, I've got the inside all painted up and, to the minimum I feel is necessary for, just in case you look through one of these mini windows and you can see the colors. But I focused all of my efforts on the cockpit and, in the radio or the navigator's compartment back here. You can see a little bit of that there. Just done, the usual detail painting and using some black enamel washes and so forth to make all that stand out. And I feel pretty good about that. This Bombay section that I talked about in the other clip is all thoroughly glued in place with tons of super glue, so that's all taken care of. And I also have, oops, keep bumping into the camera there. I also have finished up the cockpit, and I'm pretty stoked with how this came out. I feel like that the overall look of it's pretty good, and that even though you can't see a whole lot of it through the canopy glass, that it'll show well. I did get resin seats from a little company in Czechoslovakia called Pavla, and I like them pretty well. I looked at the seats from Verlinden and Aries, and they just were not as crisp or as well detailed. And try to get this in close so you can get a better look at it. I like these pretty well, other than my lousy job of painting the yellow life rafts that were used as cushions on the back part of the seats. I'm pretty happy with it. And overall, I think that this Pavla stuff was a good investment for the seats. They give you a bunch of other parts in their kit, including a complete navigator's or a bombardier's compartment, which you can see right here. But I'm much less impressed with it. The detail's pretty good, but it's not any better than what's offered in the Accurate Miniatures pieces. And what's really bad that you probably can't see is how horribly warped this part is. I don't know how you would ever even get this thing to fit, so not going to bother using that. I basically spent the money just to get the seats, and I'm happy with that. One thing about putting the cockpit together is Accurate Miniatures, I think I've mentioned this before, has what they consider a unique and cool way of handling instrument panels. This is a clear piece with recesses for each of the dial faces. And what they want you to do is put the decal on the back side of it and paint the front side everywhere except the dial faces, which is as much of a pain in the ass as it sounds like. And I'm not a fan. It makes it a lot more work than an instrument panel needs to be. And even though the results are good, I just don't feel like that's a really good strategy. I also had a huge issue with the decal. They give you a decal that's got the dial faces printed on the glue side, and when I went to use it, I didn't even get it off of the sheet without it crumbling. Which is probably because it's like 13 years old. Fortunately, they give you a second decal with the dial faces on the front, and I didn't even bother trying to water slide it. I just cut it out and glued it on here with some clear gloss varnish. So got through all that, feel like it came out pretty good, and the only thing that I have left to do here is glue the landing gear in place right here, which they want you to do before you assemble the fuselage halves. And quite frankly, hang on, I'm going to reach over here and get the landing gear part to show you. Quite frankly, I'm procrastinating on that because the Accurate Miniatures plastic is really brittle, and I'm not at all looking forward to having this nose gear sticking out of the bottom of the fuselage while I'm doing all of my finishing work. And so I've been trying to figure out if I can wait until after I've got it assembled to install the landing gear. You can see it's already broken. Maybe you can see that. It's already broken right here. Now, I think I may have a solution. I found a little company in Dallas that makes white metal versions of the landing gear parts, and I think that I'm probably going to go ahead and order those so that if I do have to put it in, before I seal up the fuselage, that I don't have to worry about snapping it off. Okay, now I know this is going long and with lots of detail, but last thing to cover about the fuselage is the gunner's turret. And bear with me here. I'm going to try to explain this. I think actually what I should do is get out the instructions, though, and show you the illustration so that it'll make a little bit more sense. Okay, so what they want you to do is they want you to glue this semicircular part to the gun mount, whatever it's actually called. Then you snap the guns in. Then you put all of that on the back side of this piece, and then you glue on the shaft. And then last, you put on the turret bubble. Now, again with the goofy engineering from Accurate Miniatures. First of all, there's nothing to locate the turret bubble concentrically with the shaft. You basically have to eyeball the positioning on this piece right here, and that's about all there is to hold it in place. So that's a bit of a problem. The other issue is that they've built this so that you can have the turret rotate, and what locates the turret ring, I guess you'd call it, is this little tab right here. And that piece means that you can't poke the whole subassembly, which I have right here, down through the top of the fuselage after it's assembled. And that's a problem because I don't want the turret on there while I'm doing all the finishing work along the spine of the fuselage for obvious reasons. And I don't care at all about having the guns movable or the turret rotatable. So what I want to do is be able to put this piece in after the fuselage is assembled. And so what I've done is I've just clipped off that little tab right there. And right now this is temporarily assembled. There's enough friction that this piece is just stuck into the back of the piece with the ammo, with the brass bags on it. And the bubble is just temporarily glued on there with masking fluid so that I could test out my ability to insert it from the top once the fuselage is glued together. And it seems like I'm going to be fine with doing that. Now, speaking of the guns, one thing that I'm super stoked about is these. These are 50 cal Browning barrels from Master Models in Poland. And these things are super cool. Hopefully you can see there's two pieces, one for the cooling jacket and one for the barrel itself. And there's two barrels in each little kit. These guys were super easy to deal with. I bought these parts through their eBay store, and I had them about a week later all the way from Poland, which was very cool. So I think those are going to look fantastic when it's all said and done. And that's my strategy, for getting this thing together. The turret will end up being one of the last pieces that I assemble to the aircraft after all the paintwork is done, and probably right before I string the antenna wires and glue the props on. So hopefully that strategy will work out well, and my decisions, made at this point will serve me well down the road. Okay, so there you go. That's where I'm at with the Accurate Miniatures b-25b. I know that got way deep into the detail and ran on a little bit long, but that's there's a lot to deal with in there. And this kind of brings up one thing that I just want to say a quick word about. As I've talked about this kit online, and this also happens with other kits as well, not just this one. But you see this often where someone will say, "Oh, I'm working on kit so-and-so, and I'm having a lot of trouble with it. The fit's terrible. It's not going together very well." And inevitably someone will pop up and say, "Oh, I'm building the same kit, and it went together perfectly for me." And that always kind of makes me chuckle. And, you may be saying the same thing yourself right now if you've built this kit before or are in the middle of it, and you may think, "Hey, I'm not having any trouble." The only thing that I can say in my defense is that while yes, I am pretty ham-fisted and pretty clumsy, and that may be partly to blame for some of the issues that I'm having getting this thing built. I, in my past life, as some of you guys know, was a motorcycle guy. And look, I can rebuild a motorcycle engine from soup to nuts with my eyes closed, pretty much. Working with precision fits is not something that's new to me. So I guess what I'm saying is that I'm not, I don't think that I'm incompetent, is what I'm saying. I think that the fit issues with this kit really are there. Now, why do some people have less trouble than others? I think something that's important to keep in mind whenever you're talking to somebody online about something like this is that you never really know what standard the other guy's working to. He may not care if there's a huge gap in the fuselage joint or at the wing root, or he may just have felt like it wasn't that much trouble to fix it, and not really even taken notice of it along the way. Basically, my point is everybody's doing their own thing and everybody's working to their own standard. So you use your standard. That's what's really important. I'm pretty picky. I want this thing to look really good, at least on the outside. I don't care much about the inside because none of that's going to show. I just want it to be strong and solid, and that's the standard that I'm working to. But because I'm trying to make a thorough report of this kit, I'm going to tell you about every single one of the issues that I run into. So anyway, didn't mean to ramble on about that. That's the deal. The next update that I do, hopefully I will be at the point where I'm about ready to start putting down some primer, or maybe I already have. Okay, if you're still sticking around, thanks for watching as always. Take care, much love.